Good morning, everyone. Are we sitting comfortably? Because then we'll begin. I did think that we could have begun this session this morning without actually telling anyone what it was about, and instead playing a bit of a party game. It is nearly Christmas. And the game would have been where I give you 3 words and you guess the topic. So those 3 words that I would have chosen would have been Tim Davie, GB News and polarisation. And maybe actually a 4th word might have been Ofcom. So kind of gets us into the heart of what we're going to be talking about, which is enhancing impartiality in news. We're going to begin by hearing from Dr. Stephen Cushion from Cardiff University, welcome, with some great research, which was alluded to in the previous session, actually, which will give us a bit of a basis to think about this discussion in more than just general terms and, set aside our own prejudices. So, Stephen, if you want to take it away.
Sure. Can I get the slides up?
Okay.
I'm not in control of this. Someone else is controlling this somewhere else. So there we go. Okay, so at Cardiff University, we are leading a project all about enhancing impartiality, as was just said. I could probably bore you for the next hour, which I'm not going to do with all the studies and research that we've done. But what I want to do is just kind of give you a flavour of the research, just in 10 minutes or so, and focus primarily on politicians presenting programming, which is obviously a big topic at the moment, but also, if I can, squeeze in some discussion about how broadcasters are allocating airtime to parties at the moment, which is obviously a big topical thing. We've seen a collapse in the vote for Labour and Conservative. It's spread across. We've got a kind of new era of multi-party politics, and that's challenging now for broadcasters to kind of recalibrate impartiality and make these difficult and complex decisions. So we've looked at that in quite a lot of detail. I am going to skate through this quite briskly, so I'm going to kind of allude some of the methods and samples and research questions, but feel free to ask me questions about that at the end. Also, our website has all the reports, so you can go into detail about all the different ways in which we've tackled this. So just to set a little bit of context to this, as it was alluded to in the last panel, there's obviously widespread allegations about so-called media bias, breaches of impartiality, memes that constantly pop up on social media, negative headlines all the time, particularly against the BBC. And a lot of those are based on fairly decontextualized, isolated, anecdotal moments that spread like wildfire on social media. What we're doing is something quite different. We want to look at patterns of coverage over time, not cherry-picking moments, but looking at patterns over many months, many years to try and come up with as was just said in that panel about systematic kind of bias in broadcasters, is that evident? And that's what the plan is. Also to carry out surveys that are, properly funded representative surveys, working with, we're working with YouGov to come up with proper surveys that actually ask questions that are, are neutral, that aren't leading, that can really inform public debate. And also interviews as well. I've been doing that yesterday, speaking to broadcasters, program makers, to try and get a sense of how they're kind of dealing with this new kind of challenge of reporting different parties and so on. So, and then we're going to be doing focus groups next month too. So all of this is designed to really kind of inform, discussions like this and to provide some more kind of hard evidence. On the issue of politicians presenting broadcast programming then. So I'm sure we're going to get on to talking about the recent Ofcom consultation. One of the things that Ofcom has done to justify allowing this convention in many ways is they've drawn on focus group research, which is flawed in many different ways. It's a good report, but it's flawed in many different ways, primarily because Ofcom uses it to quantify responses. And they've used it to say there's no public opposition to politicians presenting broadcast, which isn't, it's clearly not right. If they're going to do that, they need to do a proper representative survey. And that's what we've done in this project. It wasn't just about that question, it was generally about their views on impartiality. I would say it's probably the most detailed and comprehensive survey that's been done, looking quite a lot of detail about how you interpret impartiality, which was frustrating. If I could do it again, I would do it slightly differently, because there's quite a lot of don't knows, simply because it does get quite technical. But let me just give you a flavour of some of the headlines. Despite all the negative headlines around impartiality, there's still strong support for it. A clear majority, 68%, in favour of keeping impartiality. And if you get rid of the don't knows, 83% overall. So very clear. there is some difference within that. The younger you are, the less likely you are to support impartiality. The older you are, the more likely you are to support it. That's not a great surprise. But still, 58% of 18 to 24-year-olds still support the principle of impartiality. So there's a challenge there, but it's not, it's certainly not. Sometimes I read about young people simply rejecting impartial news. I don't think that's the case at this point in time, at least. Then we asked about whether or not the public want rules relaxed around impartiality. Sometimes you hear, sometimes suggestions around maybe one channel could have their impartiality rules relaxed a little bit, so it would allow more, editorial diversity, more, allowing more kind of opinion-based programming in broadcast news. Again, we looked at this on a scale, so we looked to see whether or not people were strongly opposed to it or strongly supported it, and you can see there quite clearly most people are opposed to having more politically opinionated program. It's quite clear. If you get rid of the don't knows, again, it's a clear, 3/4 of people wouldn't want to go down that particular route. Now, on the specific question around whether or not politicians should present programming, it's in a way it's quite difficult to come up with a question around this, and we had to work quite hard with YouGov, because if I'd have mentioned Nigel Farage, it wouldn't really have been a question around that. It wouldn't have been about the principle of that. It would have been, a lot of Reform voters, people that watch DB News supporting it, and probably quite a large majority against it. So we could have manufactured, in many ways, a higher percentage of people against it. We didn't want to do that. It was more the principle of this, rather than just picking on an individual. So what we found is, the highest, answer there was that, politicians shouldn't be allowed to present. A lot of don't knows. If you get rid of those, you're getting nearly 2/3 of people opposed to this happening. So, the way that there's other findings as well that I could have gone through, but generally the way that we interpret this is that the public don't really kind of buy this distinction that the Ofcom have between news and current affairs or non-news programming. There's some tweets I put up there just to illustrate the fact that this kind of this idea that on the one hand GB News can sell itself as being a news channel, and Stuart's, I've got your tweet that you put up a few months ago where you've actually got this bizarre situation where GB News are encouraging its viewers to vote for Farage to be the news presenter of the year, yet Ofcom wouldn't recognise that because he doesn't present news. So it's this kind of common sense thing that clearly needs to be, I'm sure we're going to get onto that in the panel, that clearly needs to be somehow resolved in a way. Okay, moving on then, thinking about how broadcasters allocate airtime to parties. There's a lot of debate about this. The debate is often around the fact that, is Nigel Farage, is Reform getting too much coverage, essentially? And I get asked that by journalists a lot. Is it disproportionate amount of coverage? And it's really hard to answer that because what's proportionate? And so what broadcasters have started to do a little bit, the BBC issued a statement a few months ago where they put out and explained why they're how they're allocating airtime. And they said things around past electoral performance, the number of MPs, the vote share, your performance at the last local elections, trends in opinion polls. And another curious one was about setting the political weather. That was, and I've heard Chris Mason use that phrase a few times too. And I guess that's something to debate. The kind of newsworthiness of a particular story. Is a party kind of leading a particular issue? And that might kind of push them up the news agenda. So all these things are kind of debating points about how broadcasters are allocating airtime. We looked at this from the point of view of thinking about, because I often see this on social media, that one party's only got 4 or 5 MPs, another one's got 72 MPs. Why is there such a difference in coverage here? So we looked at this in terms of the references to the Liberal Democrats and Reform between January and July on the BBC News at 10 and ITV News at 10. And I won't kind of go through all the statistics around this, but the top line is that the Liberal Democrats were covered far less than Reform. For Reform, it's 23%. For the Liberal Democrats, it's 13% across both those bulletins. They also, Reform led more news items, 4 in 10, whereas the Liberal Democrats, it was something like 1 in 10. And we also saw Reform feature more in terms of just being pictured, often this kind of thing you'll see particularly around election campaigns, Nigel Farage enjoying a pint, and you don't really get that kind of coverage for the Liberal Democrats too. So on a range of different methods, a range of different measures, you can see Reform being covered more prominently. Now, we asked the public what they thought about this, and this is where, in particular, the survey can get quite technical because, most people aren't nerds like me looking at this in detail and studying how you go about calibrating impartiality. I mean, even when I've been interviewing journalists, they're saying, you've thought about this quite a lot, haven't you? So to try and kind of come up with this in a survey in a way that doesn't, again, lead, because at the moment we mention reform or the Liberal Democrats, everyone's going to see it through their own party political prism, aren't they? And you're just going to get responses that reflect their own political viewpoints. So we came up, I won't read the whole thing out, but we came up with a way to kind of imagine a scenario where one party has, X amount of MPs, another one has a certain other, and, we put it that way. And interestingly, it wasn't about, the top finding was that most people just wanted equal airtime for the parties. They didn't really think about the importance of opinion polls. They didn't really think about the importance of MPs. They just wanted a slightly more equal kind of distribution of coverage. So that's food for thought. Again, there was a fair few don't knows within that too, and it's something we're going to explore within our focus groups. A quick final point before I wrap up. We also looked at the kind of allocation of airtime to politicians that appear on kind of debate shows. Often it's a focus on question time, but we also looked at Laura Kunsberg's show, Trevor Phillips, Any Questions. And so there's lots and lots of data there, but the headlines are that and this is between September 2024 and July 2025, so the kind of full political season, the headlines are it was primarily the top two parties, Labour and the Conservatives, that appeared on these shows, not Reform, not the Greens or the other parties. So I say that as a kind of interesting point of difference between how the bulletins are interpreting this and how some of the panel-based shows. Now, that might differ because we stopped in July and things have changed then, if you think about the opinion polls or even more recently about the rise of the Greens. So we could be seeing something different. So to wrap up and to kind of put a few questions that perhaps the panel might want to answer. Clearly, I mean, I'm coming from this from a particular nerdy academic perspective where I'm studying and measuring impartiality. Obviously, the speakers on the panel are far more distinguished than I am, and they're actually doing this, they've done this in practice, and so they'll have a different version of this, I'm sure. There's probably agreement in the sense that it's very difficult to measure in an objective way. I think there are certain measures that are there. But broadly speaking, the public are still very much supportive of it. The data shows that. And they're pretty much against relaxing it in any ways. And that goes as well for politicians presenting in programming. It's a complex issue. It is party political as well, so things might change in that sense. But there's clearly more people against it than support it. So I guess the question is, I know Stuart's been following this closely, what will Ofcom do next with this? They did say, in fairness to them, in the consultation, that they would consider now conducting more robust representative audience research. So that could be something that perhaps informs future policy. The other thing I'd be interested in is just hearing about what is proportionate coverage of different political parties in this new multi-party era. How do we calibrate that? On what basis? On what measure? And as I said, there's an inconsistency, if you like, between perhaps the bulletins and the panel-based programming. And then a final thought as well, I'd be interested to hear views on this. I mean, one of the things that we're encountering on a project is just a lack of understanding about all of this. As I said, most people aren't spending all their time considering this, thinking it through. But one of the things, and I've been saying this in various interviews, questions to broadcasters, is could there be more transparency in how these decisions are made? Because I thought that statement from the BBC in early September was really good because it just explained some of these judgments. Because if you explain it, I think people might understand a little bit more about why these judgments are made, because ultimately that will keep people's faith in impartiality and perhaps also keep their trust in journalism more generally. But I'll stop there and carry on.
Stephen, thank you so much. That's given us a much firmer foundation on which to have, I think, this conversation. Let me introduce our other two panellists. I'm sure you're all familiar with them. Richard Ayre, until very recently chair of the UK's independent press regulator, Impress, but he spent about 35 years, I think it is, at the BBC, former controller of editorial policy, deputy chief executive of BBC News, also a member of the BBC Trust, which we heard a bit about from Mark earlier, also a former member of the Ofcom Content Board, so fingers in just about every relevant pie. And Stewart Purvis, former editor-in-chief and chief executive of ITN, president of Euronews, and Ofcom partner for content and standards. So again, fingers in many of these relevant pies. And I think you're currently a non-executive board director at Channel 4?
Finished, I
Oh,
did.
just finished. Okay. Right, brilliant. So people in front of us who know lots about this. I do, however, I've got you here. I don't want to spend all the time talking about the BBC, but we've got to talk about it a little bit. So, Stewart, what, if anything, have we learned this week? Michael Prescott's love for the BBC, Robbie Gibb avowing his impartiality, Samir Shah trying to justify why it took so long to respond to the Telegraph leak. Where are we?
Well, I think I'm one of those people who could be called a critical friend of the BBC. And at the moment, it's very easy to be critical, but not so easy to be a friend of the BBC. After the performance, I think we should say, at the Select Committee, it was a performance in the sense that we had people saying, we all get on terribly well, we're all united, we're all trying to find the same thing. At the end of it, you thought, well, how come you've just lost 3 board members? So there must have been something much more serious going on than these debates between what's the difference between systemic or systematic or the other ways of presenting forms of bias. So I'm not sure what to make of what happens next. I'm sure that on the last panel we heard a verdict that Samir was doing his best, if you like, I think effectively saying, I'm sorry, I don't think his best is good enough at the moment. Let me give you one very precise definition. I've sat on the Channel 4 board for a number of years, and there were disagreements on the Channel 4 board, and we looked to the chair to try and bring us together and try and come up with an agreed position. We had a situation here where the Telegraph published, and everybody wanted to know what was the BBC's response. It took almost 1 week, and we now understand that was because the board or the chair could not agree with the Director General and the Director of News what a press release was going to say. That's what we had. In any other organisation where something had happened and the world was screaming for a reply, would it take 1 week for 2 senior people at the organisation to try and agree the press release? It just doesn't work like that anywhere else. And so for the BBC, it has got to come to terms with those problems. We heard various structural remedies, we heard various cultural remedies. There's got to be remedies of both, simple as that.
Richard.
Gosh, well, we're supposed to be here to talk about impartiality.
Exactly.
Boy, I was standing at the back for the last 20 minutes of the previous session, aching to come up onto the platform and talk about what needs to be done in terms of governance and public appointments, not just to the BBC, but to all public bodies. The politics should be taken out of the leadership of all our important public bodies, and the BBC's need for reform gives us the opportunity to start that process. Let's talk about it one-to-one later. What did we learn from the Select Committee? How rotten the Select Committee was. I was absolutely terrible. And I'm no great fan of the sort of Margaret Beckett form of interrogating witnesses and humiliating people and leaving them unable to answer back. But, gee, they needed a bit of forensic skill. The committee didn't know what they were trying to establish or how to try to establish it. So what did we learn, as Stewart says? We learned that everybody has total confidence in everybody else involved in the BBC. Ah, well, that's very comforting. So how did we get where we are today? One thing has emerged since then. It emerged this morning thanks to the wonderful Katie Razzle at the BBC having extracted from Mr. Banerjee, the guy who resigned 3 or 4 days ago from the board, extracted his letter of resignation, which the Select Committee asked Samir Shah to provide, and Samir said, let me go away and think about it, because it's got to be a private thing, and I'll go and think about it. She has now got it from him, and he makes it clear that he was told that the former CEO of News, Deborah Turness, had been informed by the board that they had, or the majority of them, had lack of confidence in her. How do you square that with what my friend, Samir, like Mark Damaser earlier, I say, he's a friend, a former colleague and a friend. He's a great, very, very shrewd, very clever guy. But what he told the Select Committee was that the board plays no part in appointments in the BBC because that is an executive matter. Well, if the board plays no part in appointments, why does it play a part in expressing confidence or lack of confidence in individuals? It should require the Director General to give them answers about how he runs the organisation. And if they think something's gone wrong with Panorama, they require the Director General to give them an account of what he's doing about it. It's up to him whether he sacks his head of news, his director, his head of Panorama, or resigns himself. It's a matter for the executive, not for the board. The board appoints only one person, and that is the Director General. Can we talk about
Well, we've put that right,
Yes,
haven't we?
yes, there's so much to say, but I was very struck, so I am going to move on to impartiality, but I think it's so much a part of this conversation.
Can I make a quick point around,
yes.
because it is around impartiality, and
Yes.
it does also talk about what's happened at the BBC, and that's, so I'll come closer to the microphone. Steve alluded to it in the last panel, but a lot of the discussion around the BBC is underlined by the research that the journalist from Newsnight, David Graceman, produced, and then that was obviously summarised in the memo, and that's led to significant discussion. I mean, I don't understand how that was allowed to jump the queue in a way, because obviously, and you both will know more about this than I do, there's been thematic reviews that have been commissioned. There's a lot of debate around that. The terms of the reference, the questions, big, thorough reports. I think it was talked about in a select committee on Monday. So why is David Graceman allowed to privately go off, produce this research that then goes to Michael Prescott, who was commissioned to do that by one member that's politically appointed? I mean, it doesn't strike you as the most transparent way to conduct proper, rigorous research that's supposed to inform debate. I mean, it's ludicrous, really, isn't it?
I have to confess, that's a question that I've been asking aloud all week, so I couldn't agree more. So let's come back to this question of impartiality more broadly, having had that conversation. Do we even agree what impartiality is? Stephen, it seems to me from your slide that it's not at all clear.
No, I mean, I've spent many, many years, far too many years to talk about trying to understand what it means in practice. I mean, I don't actually think it's... I mean, once you put due in front of impartiality as well, I mean, it becomes even more harder to measure, because it's all about giving the broadcasters that editorial freedom. I don't actually think you're probably ever going to get a clear-cut definition on this, but I think we'll probably come on to GB News soon, I think you start to reach a consensus, I think, when some things just simply don't have alternative perspectives, or if they do have alternative perspectives, they're very cynically.
Well, climate change is perhaps the beginning of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a particular issue. I'm just thinking more day to day. I mean, there's been reports on this where I think GB News have taken advice about the extent to which they can have alternative perspectives in their day-to-day news. Now, the moment you do that, you must think, well, why would they do that? Because if they're an impartial broadcaster, why would they want to go and circumvent the system in that way? So, yeah, there isn't a kind of clear-cut definition, but I think there's probably a shared kind of view from most professional journalists about how it's practiced.
So, Richard, when I was doing live broadcasting, the way I would think about impartiality is I would imagine myself, it's not on the one hand, on the other hand, in my mind, I would imagine myself in the middle of a story and looking round, literally doing a sort of 360-degree turn and thinking about what the alternative perspectives were on this story. They weren't all given the same weight, but to try and think what the other points of view might be and how and whether they were relevant. Is that one way of thinking about impartiality?
It sure is. It's great. Impartiality is the only word I can think of that everybody, more or less, signs up to, and nobody can agree what the definition is. Going back briefly to the Panorama Trump, pretty much every decent human being believes now, or says they believe, that the edit was misleading to the audience. And to that extent, it was also unfair to Donald Trump, because it mischaracterized the intention of the first part of that speech. But was its use a breach of impartiality? That's a much, much more difficult question to answer. And let's imagine, I know this is not a perfect analogy, so to please nobody quote me as though it were a perfect analogy of Trump versus Kamala Harris, but let us assume that Judgment Day is upon us and we are faced with going either up to eternal life in heaven or down to eternal roasting in hell, I hope the BBC would commission a panorama to inform us about those options. And it would seem to me reasonable for the panorama to do a roasting in hell, what it really means to spend an eternity being skewered by those little imps that you see in fantastic medieval paintings. Does it follow that there must be a balancing panorama about life in heaven? And if it is the job of panorama to show the really bad sides of life in heaven to balance the ghastliness of life in hell? Or if we do a program at heaven which says it's a really great place to spend the rest of eternity, has that achieved impartiality? So it's really, really tricky to know how to be impartial. And one of this fantastic piece of research, one bit was really, I think, not terribly helpful, which was you gave a choice to those who were questioned, or YouGov did, between a party that has lots of seats in Parliament but is now low in the opinion polls, and a party which has virtually no seats in Parliament but is shooting up to the top of the opinion polls. And the answer the public said is they should have an equal amount of airtime. Yeah, that's easy. If only there were two parties, wouldn't life be wonderful for broadcasters? There are at least 5 major UK parties now. If you ask that question and factor in the 5 parties and their relative positions, both in Parliament and in the opinion polls, you get some idea of what a nightmare it is for broadcasters.
In that scenario, Stewart, is that where the role of traditional broadcasters, and this is breaking down, as gatekeepers comes into play? Because it's a judgment, isn't it? You're sitting in the newsroom making a judgment. Reform's a story, the Lib Dems aren't.
Yes, I have to say I think we're missing a bit of a point here, which is that the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport has announced she's going to do something about it.
Right.
So we are debating, and you know, Richard and I have debated this for many years, and VLV members were actually at a bit of a crunch point.
And
because the government
what should she do?
Well, the question is, what does she mean by that? She says the government's going to act, and she's referring particularly to what she regards really as the kind of political almost rant, some people would say, by political presenters of programmes, posing as news, as she puts it. She basically gave Ofcom, in its consultation, the chance to come up with a fresh thought on that. They basically come up with a thought which she does not think is going to resolve the problem. She says she's disappointed with Ofcom's outcome. So we are now await a government announcement on what exactly do they intend to do about the future of impartiality. And actually no one seems to have noticed they've said that. And I think it's a really interesting point because, first of all, would it be done by the government telling Ofcom what to do? Nobody would want that. That's not the role of government. It's not the role of Ofcom to take instruction from the government. I think the question is, does it come back to Parliament? Because Parliament passed the 2003 Communications Act. And we're now in a situation, well, let me say what might have happened under the current interpretation of the Ofcom rules by Ofcom. The following could have happened. You could have turned on your radio this morning and you could have heard these words. Good morning, it's 6 o'clock. And welcome to the programme presented by Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. Today is budget day, and over the next 3 hours we're going to give you lots of good reasons why we're going to solve the problems of the British economy and why you should vote for us. Later on, some person from the other side is going to turn up for a couple of minutes and say a few words, but apart from that, it's going to be our programme and our agenda. I don't think the BBC would want to transmit that programme. It would clearly be a breach of the BBC guidelines. I do not believe that is a breach of current interpretation of the Ofcom rules by Ofcom. Now, imagine that situation. Imagine another situation where the President of the United States gives an interview to a British reporter from a British channel, and in that he makes a series of non-factual, in other words, untrue allegations about Britain. The presenter does not push back on any of them. Instead, the presenter either says, yeah, I agree, or I think you're brilliant. Now, nowhere else in the programme was there any kind of alternative view. The programme was not followed by any kinds of alternative views. One serious complaint has been made to Ofcom about that programme, And it was a real programme. You don't need to imagine it. It went out on the 15th of November on GB News. The interviewer, if you can call it that, was Bev Turner. So I wait with interest Ofcom's decision on whether they will even consider that as a breach of their rules. That is where we have got to, and that is why I think probably Parliament is going to have to step in at some point.
Stewart was the extremely well-paid editorial boss at Ofcom for years. I was the very poorly paid
You're not still going on about that.
Clearly he is.
chair of the, I don't know what we called it, but the Broadcasting Complaints Committee. In other words, the main complaints committee at Ofcom. We disagree about lots of stuff over the last decades together. On this, we are united. Ofcom has lost its way. And the question is, why has it lost its way? Is it a matter of leadership? Is it a matter of breadth? Ofcom is now responsible for regulating so much of public life. It has lost its focus on its core purpose, in my view.
Were you surprised that Mark Damazer wasn't more critical?
No, because he's nice. I asked him, if, as he was leaving, I said, are you going to stay? Because I wanted to be critical about things he said. And I won't do that in his absence. But no, he had to probably go and watch the budget or write it or something. Mark is the most wonderful. Trust me, anyone who doesn't know him, he is the most wonderful colleague you could ever work with. And he won't badmouth anybody, but he's just wrong. He should have been a bit more critical about lots of things, actually.
And I thought he auditioned for the job really well.
No. Anyone who thinks they should become Deputy Director General of the BBC, abandon hope now. It will be absolutely death wish.
Stephen, Ofcom.
Okay. Ofcom and the interpretation of the rules with politicians present, GB News, or just generally as well in terms of how that's gone about and played out. Because if you read the consultation and you read all the stakeholder, submissions that they put through as well, to be fair to some of the broadcasters, they were pointing out that just some of their programming might have current politicians that appear on them that, MPs that aren't particularly, well known, particularly influential, and that kind of informs the kind of daytime magazine programming that could be kind of interesting and useful, and it would, somehow prevent, their editorial freedom and so on. So I do think there's potentially a more nuanced way out of this. So it doesn't have to be, you allow the leader of the most popular party to have a nighttime show, 7 o'clock, and interestingly, some of the analysis that we've done that I alluded to around appearances on Question Time and other programs, Farage doesn't appear on those programs as much as he used to. And I think that's partly to do with the fact it's not about broadcasters responding to criticism that perhaps he was over-platformed. It's because he doesn't necessarily need to as much, because he has his own platform on GB News that then gets repeated in a lot of the papers. So I just wonder, is there a more sensible, rational way out for Ofcom here? So they don't lose face and they just say, well, hang on, why don't we just try and make this more nuanced? If you're a politician, perhaps you can present these programs occasionally, like that often happens on LBC, but perhaps you don't have your own daily nighttime show.
Can you, Richard?
It's a different point, actually. It just occurred to me there's another of those fascinating slides, really, really interesting, which showed that the Lib Dems feature relatively rarely in bulletins compared to Reform over the past year, but it prompted the thought in my mind, how many of the times that Reform has featured in those headlines has it been because of racism, or because of corruption, because of resignations? You don't get a lot of that with the Lib Dems. I mean, they're just too nice.
It's fair, and I would encourage you to read the report in full so you can actually look down at a breakdown of the extent of coverage which is about that. And if you take that away, Reform is still dominant. So,
Can I just say, by the way, thank God for nerdy academic
Absolutely,
perspective.
absolutely.
can I just come back on another point? Because I do take the point that was made about asking people about the MPs versus public opinion polls. And you're right, if you do ask them to, it's an easy out to say equal coverage across all the parties when there's 5. I take that point. But it was on that very specific point. You see so much of it on social media where people feel this really sense of anger And I do think that's worth confronting in many ways, to actually be transparent. It's not based on MPs, which does open up an interesting question, doesn't it? Because that's our electoral system, in a way. It's not, because sometimes when I've spoken to broadcasters, they will say it's about the total votes overall, and Reform got a lot of votes in the general election, and that should be reflected. But that's not our political system in many ways. But there could be situations where you could have a party that's really popular, but the support is spread out across the UK, and they barely win any seats. Yeah. Yet at the same time, so they would have far more votes. They'd be leading the polls, but they don't have any MPs. So I do think it does need a little bit of thought here, because the electoral system does play up some of these things that may highlight some issues that the broadcasters might want to address.
There are a number of issues. I mean, without getting too much detail, I was involved in a debate around the Mayor of London election a few elections back, when there was an independent candidate who a lot of people thought was a really good candidate, but had no kind of track record in the polls or any other measure of popular support in terms of airtime. And so, yes, this is a really important area, and you've done some really important research on that, and there isn't an easy solution. But we all need the self-awareness that these issues are going on and how they can be resolved.
Do you think that the conversations in social media, in a sense, have forced this conversation open, Stephen, from what you've seen? I think the BBC has, Tim Davie famously 5 years ago sort of nailed his colours to the Impartiality mast, which at that time I remember feeling a little bit uncomfortable with, because the implication seemed to be the BBC hadn't been impartial until then. But do you think that the conversation has become more visceral because you're seeing on social media people venting their anger or their opinion?
Undoubtedly, yeah, and that's not a new thing, is it? That's been going on for 10 years or so. But I do think it's forced broadcasters in a way to respond to some of the criticism, and that's the point I was trying to make towards the end of the presentation, which was about transparency being key. I think most people kind of understand decisions. They don't understand the difference between a news program and non-news programming. Ofcom, I understand what they're trying to do. I think, we were talking about this a moment ago in terms of what their, mandate is, their mantra is, and I think it's been very much about promoting editorial freedom. That's the response that you will blanket get, and so there is something in that. But at the same time, if you don't take the public with you on some of these things, that distinction between news and current affairs, it does need tightening up.
But Richard and I will remember from our days at Ofcom, direction of travel was a phrase mentioned. Right. We've almost got two directions of travel here. We've got this enormous debate about the importance of impartiality at the BBC and other places. And we've got this feeling that actually we don't need impartiality. I think Ofcom, coming from its concern about what does the European Charter of Human Rights say about freedom of expression, very powerful lawyers at Ofcom they're coming that way, and everyone else, the public seems to be, from your research and what's happened in the past week, coming this way, which, God, it really matters. So let's hold on to it. Let's continue for broadcasting to be special. Not to say it doesn't matter any longer because of all this social media, all these other outlets of freedom of expression. Nigel Farage has multiple outlets for freedom of expression. If he wishes to choose to broadcast, he is within a platform where Parliament has decided there should be impartiality. And I'm afraid Ofcom does not appear to the moment to be enforcing the rule, its own rule, that in all matters, whether they're on news programmes or not on news programmes, all controversial matters must be duly impartial. And I don't think having one person who pops up at the end of a discussion disagreeing with everyone else on the panel amounts to a proper alternative view.
But that suggests that Ofcom doesn't support, in a sense, one of the key functions that it's there to enforce and look over.
No, it is, if you like, overly emphasising, because of the legal advice it must be getting, about observing the European Charter of Human Rights on freedom of expression against the special place that broadcasting has. That's the collision point.
Could I just say something sort of contradicting everything I believe in, really? But there's clearly a very significant number of people who believe that the UK news agenda across broadcasting, maybe across print, but mostly across broadcasting, is driven by middle-class, white, middle-aged or older group of men. And all of that is largely probably true. And that there must be scope, mustn't there, for very different news judgments, very different judgments about what really is newsworthy today.
Agenda,
the news agenda. Yeah. And how do we achieve that whilst respecting impartiality? And I was just sitting here remembering, this is what happens when you're extremely old, in 1972, when I joined the BBC, in Broadcasting House, our training in radio enabled us to make a daily news programme, a half-hour version of what I suppose the PM programme now. And we had an experiment for 1 week in which we brought in an outsider to determine with us what was the news of that day. And I remember we had a trade unionist, I think we had a couple of politicians, to be honest, I can't remember. We had some businessman, must have been a man, of course. And we wrote a bulletin along our own sort of BBC lines at the top of the programme, the first 5 minutes, but the rest of the programme was the agenda that person agreed with us and then presented. And we required him or her to present it in an impartial way, but it was their agenda. There must be scope, and I think there is scope within the rules to do that. Yeah. And the BBC could do that, but nobody does that. And GB News could do that. GB News could have Farage one day and who's Zach Polanski the next day or whatever, and that would wouldn't satisfy audiences, but it would satisfy the rules, and it'd be good.
Absolutely.
What a fascinating thought. Right, I'm going to open it up to all of you because I know we also all want to have sandwiches. So I am here. So I'm going to come to the middle. Just there's a microphone coming just towards you. I'm sorry.
Thanks. So, no, my name's Daniel Snowman, and I worked for BBC Radio for 30 years at one time and a bit for television. I'd actually like to pick up something that Ritula Shah has mentioned in passing, knowing her own background and what was just mentioned just now. You talk about impartiality, and almost all the discussion has been domestic, political, and parties and MPs. But whenever I hear about Los Angeles burning down or floods in Pakistan or whatever it is, or immigrants being sent back home or sadly being drowned in the Channel, I think what I don't hear about is, as part of the news agenda, is the question of why some of the individual items are related to climate change as a whole. In fact, both of those issues are. So is migration in some ways. Is there discussion about what a serious, as you were just saying, balanced kind of global news, not just in the domestic broadcast, but in BBC World Service, and how is that going to be financed in the future? The larger, wider issues of what is domestically partial and what is globally wider and less partial. I'd like to know whether that's part of this discussion.
I will answer that a little bit. I mean, I certainly felt on The World Tonight, which, was internally perhaps sometimes laughed at for this. We did take those things very seriously and did think about it. I'm not sure we always succeeded, but we certainly tried. And similarly, I think at the World Service, there is a real consciousness about what the rest of the world thinks. And I spent some years working at the World Service. And I think actually, once you've done that, it does give you a very different perspective on how domestic news covers things. However, and please feel free to disagree with me, the broad range of people within domestic news are resistant, I think, sometimes to that point of view. That's my very personal take on it.
I don't agree with you on that. I'm not sure I agree actually with the premise of the programme about the connection between incidents, where they be forest fires in certain countries or what, and the connection being made to climate change. I think actually broadcasters do that regularly, actually, in their coverage of those stories. To be honest, so I think we've made the point, just made the point very well. The agenda is there for broadcasters to choose their own agenda. within the agenda, as long as they observe due impartiality, I don't have a problem. If somebody wants to do a program of right-wing talking points, as long as they're covered in an impartial way, I don't have, and same with the left-wing talking points. You're talking about a different issue, which is the amount of weight which is given to home news and foreign news, and that's always going to depend on the program's audience, again, what the particular remit of that program is. And I'm sure everyone's going to have a different view about how different programs achieve that. But I'm not sure it goes to the issue of impartiality, if I'm honest.
But I'm always looking for the reason why some large issue has
Yeah, well, that's perfectly proper and perfectly reasonable. And I personally think broadcasters do a pretty good job of that.
Although I would argue that impartiality sometimes depends on understanding the part of the story that you haven't heard. But anyway, yes.
I just think there is so much news in the world. There's so many things that are important and interesting happening in the world. It's depressing how few of those things get reported by the BBC, by ITV, by GB News. And in the good old days, because the BBC used to be rather better financed, as you know, than it is now, we would expect, when I started in the television newsroom, which was 1974 as a trainee, 3 as a trainee, you would expect the agenda, if that's the right word, of the lunchtime news to be significantly different when it became the tea time news, 5:40 news as we called it, handy time to put a news program out, and then the 9 o'clock news had a substantially different agenda. Again, there were often stories that ran in all 3, but most of the time there were really new stories. They had different agendas. That was healthy. That was good. And now, to be honest, I often don't watch the 10 o'clock news if I've seen the 6 o'clock news, because I know it's going to be broadly the same with a bit more update from Westminster. And that's principally, I think, a resource issue, but only principally. And there are BBC correspondents around the world aching to get on the air and finding it difficult to do so.
One little bit of research we did a few years ago where we looked at how impartiality was interpreted in international political news versus domestic political news. We looked at the 2019 general election and the 2020 election. We looked at the fact-checking that was done of the political leaders. We looked at every claim. And it's quite interesting that when US politicians, both Democrats and Republicans, said things, journalists felt emboldened to challenge them, to use fact-checkers, to be quite robust in some of the responses. Domestically, very different. Often you get the kind of classic he said, she said, where it's left to the parties to respond to each other. So that degree of scrutiny is quite different. And yet at the same time, the guidelines do say that, in terms of the BBC, that they treat all coverage with the same impartial rigour. So there are some slight differences, I think, that you perhaps highlight at a slightly different point that you're making, but I do think impartiality is interpreted differently domestically and internationally.
Get it? Jen, at the front, wait for the microphone.
Graham Mitton, spent most of my career in the BBC. I'm intrigued about something that's happened just now. We've been talking about impartiality. Nobody's talked about truth. And the problem with impartiality and discussing impartiality is that some people actually don't believe in truth, things which can be shown objectively to be untrue. Climate change is a hoax. It's just one of them. Mr. Trump saying that there were more people at his original inauguration than ever in history, and so on. And that is that a dilemma for us? Is that a dilemma for public broadcasting? It's a reality. It's a reality. And will certainly come up if there is a court case actually against the BBC driven by Trump.
Channel 4 did a great programme, lasted 2 hours, I think, about 3 months ago, which was the 100 top lies of Donald Trump. And a few of them were rather uninteresting, they're tiny little things, but the majority of them were major untruths, either deliberate lies or simply that he plucks statistics and facts out of the ether without any recognition of reality. And that seemed to me a really good program to do. There's nothing, it didn't lack impartiality because they didn't do another program showing how often he tells the truth, And having
You found the answer.
incidentally, can I just say, in case there's a vacancy on the Channel 4 board soon, what a good job Channel 4 News does. And you know, I'm saddened how many of my contemporaries, some of whom may have been in this room earlier, now choose to watch, as I do, Channel 4 News every night, because you get a broader view of what's happening around the world. Not a broader view of what's happening in the UK, where the BBC is absolutely supreme, but around the world, I'm afraid that's where I go. Isn't that sad?
Just a footnote on climate change. Donald Trump on the GB News interview, and you know, when they talk about the climate, it's a whole thing is a hoax. Bev Turner, yeah. So that is challenging interviewing coming from GB News.
Stephen, truth, facts, impartiality.
I think broadcasters are doing that, and in particular the BBC. I mean, I mentioned a minute ago, I've been tracking fact-checking for quite a while. And I remember coming to the BBC a few years ago when it was called Reality Check and interviewing the editor. And I came in through a new broadcasting house, and I think I got to the 7th floor, and the editor was behind a set of boxes somewhere, and I had to go and find him. If you go and interview senior editors now on BBC Verify, it's front and centre of the newsroom. It's a prominent place. And we see more references to BBC Verify in various... I think it should be more as well, and we've traced this empirically over time. But I thought there was a pretty good moment during the election in 2024 when you had BBC Verify and Chris Mason actually calling out the Prime Minister at the time after a TV leaders debate, when he made some, at the time, were seen as very misleading comments about Labour's tax plan. They could have kind of withdrawn it the next day, but they doubled down, and it built up in that news cycle through that day. And on the 10 o'clock news, Chris Mason was there calling the Prime Minister misleading, and it then went to a 2-minute studio package with Nick Erdley from Verify, forensically going through this. So I do think broadcasters are trying to tackle the truth. It can't always be achieved because things are contentious, but when they are, I think, and they were rising to the challenge at a pretty crucial time as well.
BBC Verify is one of the things I think that we should thank Deborah Tenness for having introduced, and it is a wonderful idea, and the BBC is putting more and more resources into it. I have to say it's also courageous in the sense of dangerous, because when BBC Verify gets it wrong, boy, that shoots the whole
And it has
brand.
happened. Colin, I'm going
And
to
we all make mistakes, and one day it will get something wrong.
Colin, I'm going to give you the final word.
We've just heard that the caterers have got stuck in the traffic, so the food won't be here until just before 1. Oh. So we can carry on with this fascinating discussion at least for another 10 minutes.
Oh, right, fine.
Colin,
if we're going to do that, could you keep us posted on income tax changes in the meantime?
Peter, we'll try and get in as many as we can. Now we've got some extra time. Peter, if I can go to you next at that.
I'm Peter York, and a couple of years back, with Professor Paddy Barway, he's showing here, as they say in auction houses, in the front, we did a book about the BBC and its then predicament. It was called The War Against the BBC. We believe that the BBC is very, very cautious about some matters. One, America. It's very cautious, for instance, about the story of Professor Jason Stanley and Professor Timothy Snyder. It was a huge story in America, and the BBC covers America very thoroughly. But it didn't cover this story. A pair of establishment profs at Yale deserted Yale and went to the University of Toronto because they said that the current administration had crossed the lines that they had defined in their own previous books as a line about fascism, the lie about fascism. This was hugely covered in America. I don't think the BBC has given either of those people airtime. But in a meeting convened, I think, by Deborah Turness, it did discuss creating content for the reform audience across the board.
So your question is, Peter?
My question is, has the BBC been overcautious to the point of appeasement of its enemies?
Overcautious in the way, I mean, and I guess impartiality might be waived in that direction.
I'm not able to say with the confidence that you have that the BBC didn't cover the Yale story, and it was certainly covered extensively in the States. Of course it was. My belief is that I heard a number of reports on various outlets of the BBC about the issues between not just Yale but the key universities in North America versus the White House and its attempt to defund them. But I don't know whether these two academics were featured. I've no idea. But to ascribe it to being cautious, I'm not sure that I see a necessary link between the absence of them from the air and
Stewart,
caution.
do you think one of the problems that is going to arise from the lack of leadership right now at the BBC will be caution, a kind of a cowed BBC that is afraid to?
I don't see any evidence out at the moment. I mean, actually, if you look at the coverage of the Select Committee hearing, there is one piece by Ros Atkins, which is available online, which I don't think if I was Samir Shah I'd be terribly pleased with. On the other hand, Katie Razzle said she thought I think sort of in general BBC came out of it,
Yes,
well,
some
such
came
phrase.
out of it,
So
yeah.
even within, in points of emphasis, people come differently. So no, I don't see it yet.
Fair enough.
I think Katie said not the BBC had come out well. She said that by and large, Samir Shah had emerged slightly stronger.
Yeah.
Can I make a quick point? Because you referenced as well that the committee meetings for the BBC a few months ago where they discussed reform and ensured that they reflected them. I've been putting this to various people I've been interviewing over recent weeks. We're seeing the surge of the Greens, aren't we? At the moment, the latest YouGov was 17%. And the biggest demographic the BBC need to really convince in the future is young people, and young people are more likely to vote for the Greens. So I would hope at some committee meeting soon, that's on the agenda too, to ensure that the Greens are, if they continue this surge, and opinion polls seem to matter more and more, that they're reflected in future coverage.
Is it lady there? Yeah.
Well, three things struck me listening to all this debate. And the first one was, thank you, Professor Cushion. I have had the subjective feeling that I'm seeing far too much of Nigel Farage. And that the election, Davy was having to make rather a fool of himself just to get some attention, to put it as I experienced it. And the second point is on the trouble within the executive board, that there's somebody there who I think was appointed by Boris Johnson, very right wing. Well, he's allowed to be conservative, but who was involved in setting up GB News. And I mean, if he sets up GB News, which is not set up to be really impartial, he shouldn't be on the BBC board. I don't think he's somebody who could be considered committed to impartiality. I mean, that's about the way these people are appointed, and they should be independent and not
What's
political.
What's the question?
And my third point on the big row about the Panorama programme is I have a very good friend from university who became a BBC journalist and World Service Radio, mainly. And so, I always discuss things with her when things blow up on the BBC. And the latest one, she said, on the editing of the Panorama programme, the rot started when they got that bean counter in. John Burt, I said, yes. Because they started outsourcing programmes from the BBC. She said, when I was trained, it was absolutely drummed into us that you did not, you know, presumably she meant splice things together in a way that could be remotely misleading. In other words, they're outsourcing flagship programs to people who will employ journalists and editorials who haven't been thoroughly trained.
Let's take that final point, if we may.
I mean, I think Panorama and Flagship should be, you know, made in the
I want to take
BBC
some other
by their
questions, so if I can actually ask the question, which is, the BBC has to have external partners. That's the nature of the media landscape now. It can't possibly live in a silo. But does that present problems, if we think about the rows over the Gaza documentary, does that present problems about how you ensure there is impartiality? I think, and I can be corrected by others who know differently, that actually when it comes to the splicing of that Panorama documentary, that is something that I think happened internally, and it was not related to the production house. I'm not sure about that, but that's what I believe.
Well, first of all, it's a requirement of the Charter that the BBC has to use independent production, except in news programmes. I think none of us here knows, and probably will ever know, really why the Panorama Trump edit was made. And it's very hard to see whether it was, of course it was an independent production, but the BBC has an editor overseeing any independent production.
Sorry, to be absolutely clear, it was done by a BBC employee sitting in an independent production house. And I think his name is Matthew Hill, and he works for Panorama, and he did the edit in an independent production house. So the independent issue is, in truth, not really relevant, it turns out.
Exactly what I was going to say. It is irrelevant. And the question is, how could you ensure that whether it was a misjudgment genuinely made in the belief that he was reflecting the spirit of the way that Trump got the crowd animated and angry, and he thought that it was fair to put those two clips together, or whether it was, frankly, let's get Trump. This is a perfect way of tying him clearly to the violence at the Capitol building. We will never know. The question is, should it have been caught by somebody else in watching that program? Because every program is reviewed by a number of different people. The editor of Panorama, not least, but there's a compliance officer to make sure that any program before it goes out complies with the editorial guidelines. Should they? Could they? Is it reasonable for us to expect that they would have spotted that edit and thought, I wonder why that cutaway shot it was obviously an edit there. I wonder if it was right. Is it reasonable to expect a higher editor to ask what happened in between those two bits of sync? I don't know the answer to that question. I don't sense a conspiracy among people to cover up a bad edit. My guess is it was a bad judgment.
I suspect it was done for impact. It was done for condensing it and to make an impact, and nothing more than that. That didn't mean that it was the right thing to do.
The bigger issue for the BBC is why, when it was brought to the attention last January of the director, CEO of News, and the Director General, as well as other members of the editorial guidelines group, how they could possibly have decided, first of all, that the executive had 4 more months to come up with their explanation to the next meeting of the Editorial Guidelines Committee in May, and how, even in May, the committee remained sufficiently convinced by the defence that Deborah Turness offered the committee that they decided they didn't need to do anything further about it, in view of the fact that all of us now, when we see that, say that was just not acceptable. How could so many people, there may have been some in the room, at least one in the room who thought it was indefensible, and my understanding is that the Director of Editorial Policy, also in the room but not a member of the committee, thought it was indefensible. But nonetheless, the committee chaired by Samir and with the Director General present decided not to take any further action. That's very difficult to defend, I think.
Gareth, back.
Thank you. Gareth Burness from the International Broadcasting Trust. One very small point. We're going to be conducting research into the breadth and depth of international coverage, which we'll be publishing early next year. So we may be able to provide some substantiation to what Richard was saying about the sense that certainly the BBC News agenda is narrowing. We certainly have that sense, share that sense. I wonder what you make of the decision of the BBC to edit out a particular sentence from the Reith lecture, which was heard in full by an audience, appeared to go through all the editorial checks necessary, including the script itself, but was dropped at the last minute, much to the annoyance of Rutger, who presented it. Should we worry that perhaps Trump will not be held to the same level of scrutiny going forward? Are the BBC scared?
I'll let Stewart and Richard answer that second question, but on the first question, because research is particularly my particular interest, you mentioned you're going to do this new study, and you mentioned it become narrower. Can I encourage you to look at a study we did in 2019 that was commissioned by Ofcom, which looked at the breadth and depth of BBC News generally, and at that point the BBC really were covering parts of the world that other broadcasters weren't. So it's a good baseline in many ways to make sure that, because that's a point in which you can say, have they, reduced coverage or increased it? And obviously you've got to pick particular moments as well, because it's all contextual, isn't it?
Richard.
I don't usually listen to Reith lectures, I'm ashamed to say, because they're sort of too clever for me usually. But I did listen to the first one of these when it went out, and it was brilliant. I can't wait for the next two. And oddly enough, I noticed there was an edit, because after the edit there was a bit of atmos. There was a bit of sort of, as though it was the end of a bit of audience amusement. And I thought, oh, gosh, I wonder if he said something funny that they've just taken out. I still don't know what's been taken out. Has it appeared? I haven't looked online. What was taken out?
Well, in danger of him suing the VLV.
Yes.
He said that he was the most corrupt American president.
I wouldn't have said that, Stewart, and you're a brave man.
These are not the views of the VLV, they are.
Can I have my sandwiches before I go?
I think if that's what was taken out, you can understand why, in the current circumstances, the BBC's lawyers, both in London and no doubt in the States, were saying, just play it safe, don't make it any worse.
But it does give the impression of weakness, doesn't it?
Yeah, of course it does, yeah. Of course it does. Yeah.
No, I have been a number of, in my career, meetings with lawyers when I've occasionally said, I don't care what you say, I'm going to do it anyway, including ones at Ofcom, bizarrely. But I think on this occasion, I think I can probably understand what was going on in the room, yeah.
5 billion quid later.
Yeah,
Right, well, we are, I think, going to have some sandwiches. My stomach is rumbling very loudly. We probably will hear it. Thank you very much to this great panel. Stewart Purvis, Richard Ayre, Stephen Cushing. Thank you very much.